Hey, it's Spacetown. I'm here. I'm here ready to make the second part of my Obsolescence How I Made series. And yeah, this one's going to be about the project organization and the arrangement of everything in the performance. And this is going to essentially break down what was on both of my M8s as I was playing. And I hope that this will give a lot of people some insight as to what was actually going on and what you were hearing. This is going to definitely be a lot more of a technical breakdown of these M8s and of what was happening. So if the first video was a lot of talking and a lot of just going on and on about what my intent was and what I wanted to do with the stuff with this performance, then this video is going to be a lot of breaking down individual parts of tracks. And if you're interested in the M8's sound capabilities specifically, this is going to be a good video for you to watch. I'm going to be going down both of the M8s, which is the drums and the synths, and I'll kind of explain what my intent was for doing both of these things. So before I move on, I'm just going to explain to you that I have this whole new recording setup, mostly so that everyone can see what's going on the M8 in a more clear and understandable way. It seems like it beats having to record my M8 super closely and having people get messed up with the resolution of the M8 and the resolution of the recording. I am using the M8 display program. It's actually more of a Chrome app, Chrome web app. And the details are here. It is made by Durkee Jadex. I feel like I can't say that, but it is made by Durkee Jadex, and you can find the details on here. And I will be posting this link in the description of the video so that you can do this by yourself. You can see I have my M8 right here. So I am running this off of a real M8, but because I am doing a video recording, I want to have as max resolution of the M8 as possible so that when I explain things and zoom through the screens and do all this stuff, you can see it. I'm also going to be doing a little bit of a picture-in-picture recording of my hands so that you can see what the inputs are and what buttons I'm pressing to get everywhere. And let me know if that's clear enough for you. If not, I can toy with having some sort of input display on the screen recording as well, so you get just the maximum amount of what buttons I'm pressing. But I'm gonna go with this for now and see how people feel. So, getting into it, we're going to be talking about the drums first. As I said in my previous videos, both going over this performance, Obsolescence, and Ghost Obelisks, I like to divide my M8s into different types of sounds. The most broad delineation that I have with different kinds of sounds is one M8 will handle all of my percussion, and then the other M8 will handle all of my synth parts. So what do I mean by that? And what does that delineation mean in practice? With the left M8, everything here, I have all of these different rows of drum track. Everything here is a sample. Almost every single instrument that I have is a sample. If I go through them and show you really quickly, right? Sampler, 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 sampler. Everything is a sampler. I'm going through every single instrument here, and it's all a sample. And that's kind of what I treat this M8 project as. It is a sample bank and a sample playback project for me, so that I can get into the actual percussion patterns and the actual percussion sounds that I want to make. So that is generally what this project will contain. I also have another project that we'll get into later on in this video that is my synthesizer project. And the important thing to mention with all of this, with both of these projects, is that I work on both of the projects on a single M8, right? So I have this Tech Drums April project, and I also have a Tech April project. Those are my two projects that I used for Obsolescence, and both of them can be worked on the same M8. So when I switch over to the other project, I'm going to be just switching over on this M8 like I would if I were actually composing. And I think that that's important because one of the easiest things that knocks me out of flow is when I open up a project or when I'm working on a device and then I have to switch over to a new device to do things or make changes, and it's not easily, I can't easily recall what I did or what those changes were. So a lot of my workflow around this project and around how I perform live techno in general is designed to keep as much as possible on one device as I'm composing. And then when I'm done composing, I will break everything out into their separate devices and separate control mechanisms. So that keeps the process of composition and the process of performance very separate, which I think is a very important thing. It's an important part of the way I perform, because if you watched the video about how I perform live on 2M8s, how I perform live techno, one of the important parts about performing is that I want to be able to surprise myself with what is happening on the screen or what's happening in the performance. And I can't do that if I know exactly if performance is composition, is performance. So separating the two phases is really important to me. And that's why I have everything set up the way I do here. So let's get into the actual project and I'll kind of walk us through it. With this M8 project, every single one of these tracks has a different function. All of these tracks do something different. So the composition process for each one of these drum patterns is that I intend for each one of these drum patterns to be a standalone loop that will be able to be played pretty much the entire time without, that will be my full loop. That will be the full send, ready to go, everything sounds good. And I think in dubstep it would be called jump up, the jump up part of it. Kind of like jump up dubstep or something like that. I think that that's what it's called. I'll have to check again. But each one of these rows represents a pattern in full force at full send. So when I hit play, right? When I hit play, that represents the pattern at its full intensity. And so when I perform, the point of the performance is to build your way to that intensity in what seems like a natural fashion, right? And so when I'm composing, I'm not really composing with any sort of predetermined arrangement in mind. I'm not saying that like, oh, I'm going to mute the drums here and then mute the third track here and then get the hi-hats out of the way at 3 minutes in, and then at 4 minutes in I'll bring them back. That's not how I'm composing here. I'm composing literally a couple of patterns a day, or if I'm going into a composing mode, I'll sometimes spend literally just 5-10 minutes just laying down a pattern of percussion that I want to work on that day, and then that might be all I do for the day, and I'll turn it off and then come back the next day and see what it sounds like. And so there's no arrangement happening in the composition of the part, which is kind of a weird way to think about composing, because normally when people talk about composition, when they talk about composing a track or writing a track, they are talking about it in terms of how the track evolves over time. So that's what song structure is. That's why I place this element here and this other element here and remove the first element at this time. And so when I say composition, I mean something different than that, because I haven't laid down what's going to happen over time. I have laid down the maximum intensity that I want to reach to. So it's a lot more vague than what normal composition is like. It's a lot more murky and a little bit more mystical, I would say. It doesn't make as much sense. But again, in order to surprise myself and kind of groove with the rhythm and feel that I'm actually performing, as opposed to just hitting play on a track and jumping up and down and waving my arms for 3 minutes while the track plays out, this is what I need to do to get to that point in the performance. So that's why I compose this way. So each individual track does a separate thing, and I'll go into all of them right now. So the first track in each project, and in this drums project, the first track will always contain a kick drum. And you're going to find this kind of structure with my M8 project, with my M8 drums project for the whole thing, where each one of these tracks corresponds to a different element, a different instrument in the whole percussion pattern. I do this because I want to be able to, one, organize it compositionally in my mind, so I'm not losing things in different tracks and being like, oh, where did the kick drum end up in this project? Where did the snare or the hi-hat end up? Is this pattern actually, if I mute this part, is the pattern actually going to make sense or not? So that's one of the main reasons why I organize everything by instrument in each track. And it also helps the performance, because when I map the volume of this track to my kick drum. This is the mapping that I'm doing right here. When I twist the first knob on the left M8 controls, I'm not even doing the mapping per instrument in here. I'm doing the mapping in the mixer screen. So I know that every time I turn down the first track and the second track, my kick drum will go away. And I know that whenever I turn down, the fifth track, then my, big structuring percussion pattern will go away or come back. That will help the performance, because I know that when I twist a knob, this specific thing will happen, and I'm never worried about having to change the different configurations of the performance as I'm performing. All of this work, and this is something that's kind of interesting in the composition process that I've been kind of developing over the last couple of years, is I'm doing a lot of work to make it so that the performance itself is, one, stress-free, and two, fun to do, right? I'm doing a lot of the planning of the performance before I even get into the performance. And so, you'd think that, oh, doesn't that make it more boring if you're planning all of the performance in the composition process? But it actually makes it a lot more fun for me, because when I'm doing the composition, because I've separated it so much from the active performance, I often just forget about what I did in the composition process, and then when I'm playing out or when I stumble across something cool, I'm like, this sounds good, and I'm surprised by this, and I'm just gonna ride this for a little bit longer. Whereas if I just played a prearranged track in full, that would be a lot less interesting to me. So that's a lot of words to say that this first track is always going to be my kick drum. And it's not actually just the first track. Both the first and the second tracks in the M8 are my kick drums. I do this, I sacrifice one track for the same instrument because I want to create a lot of depth and width to the kick drum. I got a question on my performance video a long time ago asking how I get my kick drums to be big, and the answer is you just have to layer them. You can layer them. You can do the sound design in a digital audio workstation and layer them there and make it sound big there. You can free up a track by doing the sound design of the kick drum beforehand in a digital audio workstation like Ableton or something. But I typically, when I compose, I just don't like to do that. It just takes me out of my flow, because I'm thinking about the steps that I have to take in order to make sounds on the M8, right? And the steps that I have to do for sound design to make big drums involves me going into Ableton, opening up the project, picking two kick drum samples that I like, layering them on top of each other, doing the EQ in Ableton. Once that sound design process is all done, I'm not finished yet. I have to export it, put it into the M8, make sure that the kick drum is easily accessible for me and I know where it is, because I don't want to do all the work and then forget where the kick drum sample is located. Then I have to load it in and make sure that it sounds good in the M8 sampling engine. And that's just like a whole mess of work that I really don't want to deal with, because it just completely takes me out of my flow. You might say, oh, well, you're missing out on some really cool kick drum sounds that you could sound design, and you know, that's fine. I am interested in functional composition process, where I am making sounds that sound good to me and I will use immediately, as opposed to doing a lot of work on the sound design beforehand. And that's also why I like to use samples, is because I'm offloading a lot of that work that I would do in the sound design onto someone else, right? Someone else has designed the sound, made it sound really cool, can make it sit in a mix really well. So if I'm doing that, then if I'm offloading it, then I can just do the work of arranging it and putting it into the project and things like that. So with my kick drums, I'm mostly using samples. I'm not doing anything super special with it. Almost everything here is the default setting, except for my amp setting here. The amp is usually just bringing it up to just over the level of distorting the kick. So if I bring it down and I play the pattern, right, it sounds pretty clean. It's the kick drum sample itself. And then if I bring the amp up a little bit, you can just hear the distortion a little bit, not too much. Like I'm not bringing it up to here and making some sort of like gabber kick or anything, right? It's kind of staying within the realm of reason and distorting just a little bit to give it that warmth and that depth that I like to have in my kick drums. And you know, I spend a lot of time designing the kick drum patterns in the M8 because the kick drum is really the guiding force in all of techno. So the kick drum kind of centers the listener's attention. It provides, it's the grid that everything else works on. So it's really important to make sure that your kick drum sounds good and sits in the mix well. So, and you can actually, hopefully you can see the cursor right here. I actually like to use this little waveform display to see where my kick drum is and how much it's distorting, right? Because if I hit it without any amp, if I play it, you can see that the waveform is sitting pretty squarely in the middle of the waveform display. And then as I increase the amp, you can see that it's hitting the top of the display, right? It's flattening out. And when the waveform flattens out on the tops and the bottoms of the display like that, that means that you're going to get some distortion. So the amount of distortion that you want is subjective, it's up to you, but using the waveform display to kind of figure out exactly how much you're distorting is something that I like to do here. And so if I'm going way out, or if you go like super far out there, you get this really like intense waveform that's like, oh, it almost looks like it's just a solid line there. So that's one trick that I like to use for my kick drums, and for any sample-based thing in general. Actually, anything in the M8 in general, is this waveform display can tell you how much you're distorting. Again, everything remains the same in the envelopes part. So everything is pretty just straight up with the kick drum. Nothing too over the top, nothing super interesting. I like to just set my velocity at the max so that I know that I'm getting the maximum volume out of the kick drum. Because again, the kick drum structures everything. Now, with the second track, I also have a kick drum. And with this kick drum, I like to pick something that will complement the first track really well. So with the kick drum sound design, I like to think of the first track, the first track kick drum sound as my bass, right? Or the bass level of kick drum. And so that is kind of like the body of the kick drum. And then these ones, with this track, this is kind of the top, the little like crunchy, noisy part of the kick drum. Right. It doesn't sound as crunchy or noisy as it could, right? But together, they create right, as opposed to just, it just adds enough of a layer on top of the original kick drum that brings out the depth of whatever the kick drum is supposed to be. And then you might notice that with the second track, I also have this kind of this almost like this eighth note pattern happening here, as opposed to the first track, which is just a quarter note, right? The second track, I've just heard this in a lot of like business techno tracks where they'll have like a little like almost like a percussion like sound on the in between the kick drum hits. So and that just adds a little bit of urgency to the kick drum track, right? If I got rid of this, then, you know, let's listen to it. Right, it sounds fine, but, you know, if you want just a little bit of extra activity, a little bit of extra urgency, then adding these in, right? And it allows you to utilize one track for multiple purposes, which is always important in a tracker situation. So that's what these eighth note patterns are for. Moving on to the next track, the third track. This track is usually a pretty, it's what I would call a rolling percussion pattern. If we go into the phrase itself, it's just filled up in a 16th note pattern with usually a really low and kind of thumpy percussion sample, or a kick drum that's been filtered and modified in a way to make it sound less like a kick drum and a little bit more like a tom or a different, like essentially a different like bass drum. So if I play this out, this is something that I noticed in a lot of business techno as well, where having this kind of 16th note rumbling pattern at the low end of the mix brings a lot more urgency to the kick drum pattern itself. But it does it in a way that doesn't overlap with what the hi-hats are supposed to do. If I kind of bring myself back out to the main screen and play out what this track is supposed to sound like without that rolling pattern, right? You get a kick drum, you get that little like urgent eighth note pattern, or the urgent, you know, whatever's off the downbeat or in between the kick drums. And then if I add in that rolling pattern, right, it sounds like there's a little bit more urgency there. And you can add this urgency with the hi-hat pattern, with the closed hi-hat 16th note pattern. But often you want to reserve a way to add urgency without the hi-hats in, because what you'll notice with these low patterns here is that when everything is going full blast, you're not going to notice this 16th note pattern. So it kind of disappears when everything is going full blast. So let's, play it. You can hear this pattern, right? But then as I add in more elements, you're going to start to lose it in your ear's perception. Right? I haven't even put in the hi-hats here, and it's a little bit hard to notice it. You can still hear it if you pay close attention, but you're getting a little bit far away from it. Right? And then when I bring in the hi-hats, then it's basically inaudible. So why have this pattern here if it just disappears when everything is going full blast? This pattern is important because it allows you to establish the urgency of the track without having to utilize your hi-hat layer. When I'm thinking about how to build and break down and bring the song or bring the track to different levels of energy and intensity, it's important to kind of have these like quote unquote redundant layers of sound design. You can kind of think of it like how people summit Everest, right? They don't just immediately climb to the top full stop and don't worry about anything, right? You can't just go from the bottom to the top straight up. They have this thing that they call base camp, which is actually several thousand, if not like tens of thousands of feet above sea level, because you need to get acclimated to that air and those conditions, and then you go to like the camp 1 and camp 2 and stuff like that. And then sometimes you go up to camp 1, acclimate, and then come back down, and you do it over a period of time as you climb up these mountains and stuff like that. So I kind of take a similar approach, if not exactly the same, a similar approach to the way that I like to try to build these patterns, where having a base layer that disappears when everything else comes on is important in setting a baseline of intensity before I add in even more intense parts, right? And it allows me to get more intense without having to go full on and have no layers or no levels in between low intensity and high intensity parts of the track. So, right, it already sounds like something is going to, it's exciting, you're looking forward to something, right? But it's more intense than just having the normal kick drum pattern, right? This normal kick drum pattern, having just a single kick drum pattern playing, it is a little bit spare and a little bit sparse in a way that kind of begs the question, like, why is this happening? Why is there only a kick drum here? And if you have an answer for that in other parts of the track, or if you're gonna build to something from just the kick drum, then that's totally fine. But if a large part of your track is just the kick drum on that very like easy to understand pattern, then this sub layer is almost necessary in order to establish some sort of motif or urgency away from just the kick drum. And I have it on all of my like 4 on the floor patterns, right? So I have this. Right, it's the same thing where this pattern, these samples sound good, but once I add this rolling pattern, once I add this rolling percussion, it takes the place of the hi-hat without being a hi-hat, which again is important for mix and intensity's sake. It's the same all the way until I get to this part, I think. Yeah, to the 5th. And then it changes, but I'll go over that in a little bit. So that is what this layer's for. Let's move on to the 4th track. So the 4th track is usually the first non-sub-level track, sub-level sound that I like to bring in. This will usually take the form of some sort of FX sound or some sort of percussion sound, but instead of being on the low end of the EQ spectrum, your toms, your kick drums, stuff like that, this will usually be a little bit more like a clap or something similar that in the same arena as a clap. In this one, I added a syncopated pattern that signifies that we've arrived at the first place that I want to be without, again, going into full send mode. So this is what this pattern, this sample sounds like. Right, it's almost like a snare sound. It's like if someone was hitting a stick against some sort of like weird rubbery substance, right? It's like wood rubber. If I were to give some weird like sommelier-esque sound design description of it. So in context, then, it sounds like this. So we're going from this rolling percussion pattern, and this fourth track, and this is kind of the case in all of my drum patterns in general. When this fourth track comes in, then we've arrived just before what I consider max intensity. So, right, it's not quite enough to signify that we've arrived, but it's enough to say, oh, there's some element here that isn't the kick drum and is perceptible in a way that I intend the listener to notice this, to be able to groove with this, right? Whereas with this rolling percussion pattern, there's no real intent for anyone who's dancing or whatever to be able to kind of like lock onto a groove and understand that like this is what I can interact with. So this is the first indication that there's something here in this track and I'm going to build up. And it's the same thing with the next one. That one's a little bit more of a popping sound. This one is a little bit more subtle, and again, it's not, these are just guidelines for the tracks. I organize it this way because it makes sense to me, but if it doesn't fully fit into what the track is supposed to do, that's usually okay, as long as I have some sort of like intent for it, so. Right, so those are kind of what that sounds like. The fourth track is getting us to full intensity without actually being there yet. And then the fifth track, then, if those first four tracks are getting to the meat of the track, the fifth track usually signifies that we're there, right? And so the fifth track in my first row, in the first drum pattern, is actually a little bit unconventional. So I'm going to go down to the second track, and this is usually a very loud, very impactful pattern that happens once every couple of bars. With all of my other tracks and my other patterns, you can see I didn't even add another phrase here because it's supposed to happen every four beats. On like clockwork, right? I don't want to do anything other than have this repeat over and over and over again every 4 beats. But with these patterns, you can see that I do have phrases in here that that aren't just the first one, and in these phrases there's nothing in there because I want this to be a sound that plays out over time, that signifies a phrase length that's longer than just 16 steps, right? So with this one, it is a big, loud, kind of like impactful pattern. So I'll play it out here. All right, it's gonna go. And so that pattern kind of allows me to structure the rest of the drums around it, right? It's kind of like the highlight of the drum pattern. if I put it back into context with the rest of the track, right? You know, we're getting there. This is, you know, there's something to groove to, but it's not like fully formed yet, right? There's room for us to grow in the performance. And then when I open this up, right? So by having a pattern in this broader pattern, by having a phrase that, or I guess this is a chain. By having a chain that goes on for longer than just a single bar, a single measure, it allows me to kind of add a lot more substance to the drum pattern, and kind of signify that there is more there and there's more to come. And with this pattern, we usually arrive at like what I would call the first verse, or the first like right leading up to the chorus of the track. And then along with this fifth track, the sixth track is usually a sub, it's kind of like a complement to that first, to the fifth track. So in this case, if the fifth track sounds like this, then the sixth track will usually be something that is a little less impactful, right? So we're working with another rolling percussion pattern, but this one sits in the same kind of sound space that the fifth track does. So if I play both of them at the same time, right? So you can hear that the sixth track in this particular drum pattern is there to fill the space that the fifth track leaves by having a you know, 4 or 3 extra phrases that don't have anything playing in them. And yes, I could be cleaner. I could probably place these patterns into the fourth, the fifth track, and like fill it out so that I'm not using two tracks for one sound. But for me, it makes sense, and it kind of is filled out enough that I'm comfortable with where we're at. So then let's put this into context. So we have, it's better for me to mute at this point. So we have the meat of the track here, right? But when the impactful phrase ends, we're kind of left with a pretty familiar part of the pattern, right? If I've spent some time building the rest of these patterns up, then the space in between this hit, right, that hit, and when you're waiting for it to come back around, you've already heard of that stuff. So what I like to do when I'm building up is I like to introduce both of these elements at the same time, right? And now you're listening to something new in the space of the impactful part of the pattern. And it's usually the same thing. So it's kind of like a counterpoint to the fifth track, and it's going to be pretty similar for most of these, right? Sometimes I switch it up and like change the ways that each of these go. So in this case, the impactful part of the sounds, the impactful part of the pattern is here in the sixth track, right? And then so if I play everything out, then or maybe in this one, right? Even in the first drum loop. So the fifth and the sixth tracks usually come in at the same time, and these represent like we've arrived at the highest intensity of the track that we can get to without using hi-hats. And so now that I've kind of like built up everything over time, now we're going to talk about the hi-hats themselves, because the hi-hats, if the rest of the percussion patterns are there to structure like the beginning and the end of each part, I guess each track, the hi-hats structure the middle, and they structure the breakdown and the build-up. With these hi-hats, when I introduce the closed, before we go into these, so the seventh track is usually the closed hi-hat. It is invariably a 16th note pattern with no real variation on the hi-hat. It's just a 16th note pattern of closed hi-hats. And I like to usually keep the decay on these really short, so that we don't, so that one, I can use this as like a performance tool later on, right? Kind of like change the way that it sounds if I want even more intensity. And also so that they don't overlap into each other and it doesn't sound like it's like cutting itself off. And then with the eighth track, it is again invariably, and it's the same case with every single one of these tracks, or these chains. It is a open hi-hat on the eighth, or on the second, sixth, 10th, and 14th, 15th. I don't know. Yeah, 10th and 15th steps of the pattern, right? And the reason I say invariably is because it is really important to me for these hi-hat patterns to sit where they do and not change, because they work in tandem with the kick drum to structure the track for me. Again, this is something that like I stick pretty, like I stick with my guns here, and I kind of just like, this is the way I do it. I'm sure that I could come up with more interesting patterns if I strayed away from this, but this kind of goes back to the thing that I was saying about structuring your performance in the composition phase, so that when you are performing, you don't get confused, or you don't like get weirded out by things that are happening in your song, and you don't know what to do with them. And you know, maybe this is something that I'll build on for my next set, something that I can like work on. But for right now, the hi-hats are there to support the kick drums, and this is the main structuring device of each track. So if I play the hi-hats and the kick drums by themselves, right, you have a very easy way to understand where everything else is in the mix. And so the reason I have these, you know, I'm very strict about the hi-hat patterns is because when I bring in the closed hi-hat, that usually means like we're in our first verse of the track, right? So everything is out, and I'll usually even bring in my hi-hat, my closed hi-hat, before I bring in the big kind of centerpiece of the pattern, right? So if I have this and I'm trying to build, I'll introduce the hi-hat in. And because it's so high frequency in the EQ spectrum, it allows me to kind of like add, to give a taste of urgency and intensity in the track before we introduce like the big things, right? So and now I'm at almost full intensity, and then if I want to really full send it, really like, you know, get the jump up going, that's when I bring in the open hi-hat. And these are these are like the things that I perform the most with, and by perform I mean like actually change the parameters of. So if I'm at my, everything else is here except for the hi-hat, then when I bring in the hi-hat, now we're fully here, now we're like ready to go, right? And now that I've introduced the open hi-hat, if I want to make the pattern more intense and sound like, oh, okay, like everyone's like getting ready, getting excited, getting ready to go, I'm going to open up the decay of this open hi-hat. Now we're getting a little bit more ravey, right? We're getting into the territory of like, I feel like if I drop an acid bass in here, then like we're off to the races. So, and I can dictate the intensity of the track and kind of like dictate the mood of the performance by bringing in and opening up the decay of this open hi-hat. And so you'll see that after I do a breakdown, right, I'm often going to open the hi-hat because I do a breakdown and a build-up, and then I want everything to be at max volume and max intensity. And so by opening up the hi-hat after I've brought up all of the synths that I want to and all of the, the drums that I want to, then we're getting to a point where everything is like at its full send, full volume, and the open hi-hat really kind of like is the cherry on top of that intensity of that like part of the performance. So that is pretty much how I structure most of my tracks in the drum patterns. Something that I will say is that the structure slightly changed with these kick drum patterns that aren't on the 1, 2, 3, 4, right? So for something like this, it changes a little bit, but not by that much. So like I still have like my really intense my really intense part of the pattern on the 5th track and the counterpoint to that on the 6th track. So and then adding in the 6th. So, it's a little bit different, but not that much. So yeah, that'll do it for the drum patterns. Let's get into the synth parts. So the synth parts of the M8 project, of this Obsolescence performance, the synth parts are going to be structured pretty differently from the drum patterns. It's because the synth parts aren't really meant to operate in a single combined unit like the drum patterns, right? I'm going to go back into the drums. If I play, they're kind of allowed to work with each other. So I can, if I play this, right, and then I add the kick drums from a different pattern, it kind of works, right? It works, it still works well, but I'm not really trying to like mix and match the different patterns. I'm composing these drum patterns to work with each other specifically, and then any kind of added synergy between different patterns and different kick drum patterns is just a bonus. But really, each of these rows is supposed to be a standalone drum pattern. It's supposed to be a standalone loop that plays by itself independently. With the synth project, this is completely, I'm disregarding that point completely. Each one of these synth elements is supposed to work with any other of the synth elements. that isn't usually the case in practice. So when I'm, sometimes I'll run into different configurations of these patterns where I'll have a baseline going, right? I'll have a baseline going and it doesn't work. And it might not work with this whatever pattern then, right? Sometimes it doesn't happen, but for the most part, all of these parts are supposed to work independently. And so right here, we've run into a situation where, like, I don't know if I would use this, like, configuration personally, but then in the performance, it's about me problem solving and being like, oh, what if I get rid of the baseline, or what if I get rid of this part and just let this whole part ride by itself? So stuff like that, right? So the point of all of that is to say that each one of these chains is supposed to work independently of any other chain. I'm not playing by row. This isn't a real song, right? The song is this specific chain plus a drum pattern, right? Whatever that chain is plus the drum pattern on my left M8. So when it comes to actually composing with this synth project, I take a very different approach to the actual composition. With the synth project, I still break everything down by track, but because nothing is really supposed to work super well with each other, it allows me to go a little bit more heavy with how big each chain is supposed to sit in the mix. So I'll go through each of these tracks by themselves, and I'll kind of demonstrate what the performance of the techno project is supposed to be. So the first track is my bassline track. This is essentially all bass lines, and I have like a whole set of bass lines here, and these are all just kind of like ready-made beds of sound for me to do things with. So I have like this one here. Right, or this one here. This one is a little bit more syncopated, or I mean a little bit rolly. And then I also have added a couple of like acid bass sounds here. So with this one, an easy way to make an acid bass line is to use the slide command in the phrase view. So this would be PSL, or pumpkin spice latte, and you only want one pumpkin spice latte, and you add it on every single part of every single step of the phrase, and then in whatever synth sound you're making, you just bring the cutoff kind of low and you turn the resonance basically all the way up, and you make yourself an acid bass line. And then you can make things more intense by like increasing the amp, right? So changing the limiter differently. But yeah, so and so occasionally I will throw in an acid bass line if I need to, if I want to, if I am trying to transition away from a more melodic part, but I don't have any atonal parts that I want to play. Sometimes I'll just noodle around on an acid bass line and go from there, right? I'll try this one too. Let's see. No, that's not my acid. This right here, maybe? No. Okay, so I guess I only have one. But yeah, that's kind of what this track is for, is bass lines and the acid bass line that needs to stand by itself. So why am I talking about acid bass lines and normal bass lines? It's because the way that I think of the synth parts and the way that I'm trying to transition between different sections of a performance is the left part of oh, excuse me, the left part of this M8 project is my quote-unquote melodic part. So everything here has like a semblance of melody or a semblance of like tonal structure around it. And then we have my ambient separator divider line here. And then once I get into my 5th, 6th, and 7th tracks, everything here is atonal, right? So by having both atonal and melodic sections of synth parts in this M8 project, it allows me to naturally structure performances so that if I want to transition from one part to another, I just move over to the right and start playing sections or chains from this part over here. So let's say I am doing something like this, like this. Right. It's not like super melodic, but there's a semblance of tonal structure there. And then I want to kind of like move away from that and like start getting into some like grimier stuff, right? So I'll introduce this atonal pattern and then another atonal pattern and then get rid of the melodic patterns. Right. And then I'm in the atonal part, and I can kind of like mess around with whatever I want there. But that's what the delineation here is for, is that I have a melodic section, an atonal section, and then when I want to switch between them, I will just move over to the right. And so again, this is part of the structuring a performance, doing a lot of performance work before actually doing the performance, right? So I'm not figuring this out in the middle of the performance. I've already pre-planned my project structure so that I'm not worried about, I know where everything is. So I have my baseline track here. Moving on to the next track. This is what I'll usually call my tonal leads, my melodic leads. And this is just like a set of notes or a set of tones or a pattern that I want to like structure a track around. These are usually pretty like big, loud, kind of here I am patterns. So let's try with, this 11, right? So, it's a big, loud, like this is where I am, maybe with here. Right. It's taking a lot of the mix up. It's trying to kind of be like, yeah, this is like, And so with this track and all of the chains here, this is the one where you can play the most with the cutoff, right? So if I have like a bass line that I'm messing with, right? So let's go back to, if you have a bass line that you're messing with, right? And you have the melodic lead here, you can play with a cutoff, and this is like the performance part, right? So if I want to like bring the intensity up, I'll open up the cutoff. And that's where most of that work will happen. So it's a lot of like, just the design of these synths is usually in macro synth and usually meant to like provide a like at least a semblance of tonal structure again. So, well, okay, maybe this is a bad example. That doesn't have any total structure, but okay, that one doesn't either. See, and so this is something that I kind of like went through when creating this performance, and this is something I mentioned in the last video where I kind of moved away from melodic stuff, more melodic stuff, and I kind of like dove deep into the atonal and kind of like dirty and grimy sections of sound design. I just kind of moved in that direction because it was more interesting to me. So So a lot of these quote-unquote melodic leads aren't really even melodic. This might be the closest synth. So you know, by tonal structure, I mean if I take the instrument and change it to a different note, it will reflect the pitch of that note. Right, so you can hear that the pitch is clearly changing according to the note value that I'm sending to it. That's what I mean by melodic leads. In the third track, then, I have what are called, like, I guess I would call them like melodic rhythmic parts. So they're taking the same idea in terms of sound design from the previous section, where if you have a synthesizer, a synth sound, then the note value that you send to that synth sound should reflect the pitch. The pitch should reflect the note value that you send. So with something like this, right, you can still hear that there's some sort of like melodic structure. There's a tonal structure here that is being reflected, but instead of being a lead line where it's like, I guess with the lead line, I would like get rid of, I don't want to do this without deleting it, but I would get rid of like, something like this. It would be like this. So that would be a lead line, right? It has a lot of room and a lot of space for the synthesizer sounds to breathe. With the rhythmic part, I add in a lot of different, it's a lot of like really rolly, really busy parts. So I need to do this too. Right. So going from that previous sound where it's spare, but it allows the synth to resonate out, do its thing. This one is a little bit more busy and a little bit more intense to listen to. And so the combination of those two usually allows a kind of interesting play between the lead and the sub and the rhythmic pattern. So right, so you can kind of like play with either of those two cutoffs and the filter cutoffs for the synthesizers. And you can kind of like have an interesting back and forth between the two, almost like a conversation. And so usually my, again, quote unquote, melodic part of a performance will have a bass line, this melodic lead, and this melodic rhythmic part all playing at the same time, or kind of like changing between the two. And then when I shift over to my atonal parts, that will usually happen pretty organically. But before we get into the atonal section, I'm going to go over this fourth track here. So this fourth track is almost entirely, is basically entirely ambient chord pads that are used to introduce and leave the performance entirely. So in here, and this is just going to be the opening to Obsolescence, is this wave paraphonic synth that starts, that kind of leads into the whole performance. Really moody, really like, you know, kind of really mysterious. It will usually be some sort of 7th chord or a 9th chord or something like that. And it just like is this bed of sound to bring us into the performance without just starting off with like a huge bang and like we're ready to go. You'll notice that if you listen to a lot of other techno sets, they'll kind of like have this opening part, right? No techno set really just kind of like starts with kick drum and just keeps going, right? It will usually have some sort of introduction to it, and so the way that I like to introduce my sets is with this kind of like pad chord thing, right? And again, almost entirely a paraphonic, wave paraphonic macro synth instrument. The timbre really significantly changes the way that this sounds. So I usually like to leave the timbre alone, and then the color will change the chord that's being played. So this is usually a set and forget synthesizer instrument. The only thing that I usually play with is the cutoff. So, and that's really just to like, it kind of acts as a fader for myself, so. You can get to almost silent if you bring the cutoff all the way down on a low pass filter here. So, you know, it's pretty much the same. Every once in a while I'll toy with having these like more melodic parts. Right, something with like a little bit more build up and a little bit more interest, but I never actually used any of those. I only ever used this chain right here. So they're there if I want them, and if I want to kind of like add a little bit more interest into the performance, but usually I just stick with one and go with it. And again, this is mainly for intros and outros, so I'll usually begin and end a set with these ambient chord parts. So if I like want to structure a performance, I'll kind of like have this like, and you'll notice this if you like listen to the actual performance of Obsolescence. I'll start with this, and then I'll kind of introduce a bass line, right? And then once I am done with the bass line, I'll introduce a lead, and then the sub part. And then at this time, the chord, the pad is usually just kind of muddying up the mix. So by the time I have these first three tracks opened up, I like to take away the chord pad, because it doesn't really add anything once we're getting into the actual meat of the performance. So again, mostly there for intros and outros. My fifth track is the first part of my atonal section. These are what I'm calling atonal leads. And it's going to mirror the same structure as the second and third tracks. So I have a lead part on the second track, and a lead part on the fifth track. And then I have a rhythmic part on the third track and another rhythmic part on the sixth track. And the main delineation between these two is that the left side is melodic and the right side is atonal. So with these ones, I like to kind of, for the sound design, try to go as like weird as possible. I like using this toy shape a lot for the macro synth instrument. Right, it kind of like just gets itself into atonal territory really easily. I also like to use the post limiter as opposed to the clip. Post usually gives you like really dirty and grimy distortion after you set the amplifier high enough. I also like the feedback FM shape as well. This gives a lot of like really interesting, like really dirty low ends. So. And it kind of, and because it's like a feedback FM, it's already atonal, so you don't need to do much work to get it into an atonal place, right? Which is, you know, helpful for that. And, you know, feedback FM again, right? But you'll notice, like, with these patterns and the way that they're being structured, they're meant as like centerpieces of the atonal section of the performance, right? So oops. And then with the more rhythmic parts of the atonal sections, again, it's more rollers, you know, a little bit more regular, not like a lot more phrases with 16 steps in them, a lot more regular. Right? But they're there to complement the atonal part and give it a little bit of a push and pull. So if you want to emphasize the more synchronized big lead part, then you open up the filter cutoff there. And then if you want to move away from there and get into a little bit more of a groovy, a deep sounding part of the track, then you'd kind of open up the more rhythmic parts of it, right? So here I have both the lead and the rhythmic part going. And so if I want to like get really heavy on the lead, right, and then, you know, this, we can go max intensity and then dial it back a little bit, right? And then if we want to bring in the more melodic part, I mean the more rhythmic part, and so there's a push and pull between these two kinds of patterns, right? And so I think the main guidelines and the main principles that I go by when I'm composing these kinds of patterns is, with the rhythmic patterns, it's a lot more, they're just more regular. You should be able to tell when the pattern ends and starts, or when the pattern repeats. And then with the leads, it's not so much about when the pattern repeats as it is about like how much it cuts through the mix and becomes its own unique thing. So that's kind of the atonal sections. The seventh track here are what I'm calling like my big nasty synth parts. These are just like and this is what the kind of the middle of the performance was grounded by, was these really big mean sounding tracks, or these big mean sounding parts. So. So these really mean sounding parts are there to kind of act as a mean version of the ambient chord pads, where if you want to transition between sections, and you've kind of like played yourself into a dead end and you're just like, I need to get out of here somehow, I need to get back into a different section, you can, this is a bit of like a get out of jail free card, where you just start one of these with the cutoff all the way down and then slowly fade this in and slowly get rid of the other parts, right? At the beginning, it's barely audible, right? But as soon as we get into about like the 50, like the 50th value of the cutoff, you can start hearing it. And then when we get into like 90 and 100, it gets really, really like mean and like angry, because the resonance is all the way up there. So this is a really easy way to get yourself like out of a jam if you need to if you need to just do so. So like if I'm playing my way into like an atonal section and I have no idea how to get out of there, how to move back to a tonal section without it being really jarring, I'll just throw on one of these mean guys and just go for it, you know, and just do my switching there. It's kind of the equivalent of like a backspin on a DJ. It's like, you know, I've beat matched, but I don't know how to put the songs on top of each other, so I'm just gonna flip the fader over and then backspin the existing track out of existence, and now we're in a new track all of a sudden. So that's what this track is for. And then the 8th track is pretty much unused. I didn't actually use any of it. It was almost entirely for like having the like 16 steps of a pre-existing drum pattern that I recorded. I rendered out onto its own sample, and I just have it, you know, I just have it as its own pattern, because you know, when I'm composing, I just want to be able to listen to things in context. So if I do this, right, and I think I messed up the BPM a little bit on on the recording, but it's there to just like allow me to listen to these things as I'm composing them in the context of actually having a drum pattern underneath it. So yeah, those are all of the different ways that I use my M8s. That's kind of how I organize my projects and how I perform and how I arrange these things so that when I do perform, everything makes sense to me. I think this is going to be kind of a long video, so hopefully this was a lot of good information. And yeah, stay tuned for the next video. That will probably not be related to obsolescence, because the next part is going to be something about the visuals, and I need to really structure that a lot more. I have to figure out how I'm going to talk about the visuals. So it will be probably something different for the next video next week, but yeah, stay tuned. I have to do the like, share, and subscribe thing as usual, so I can get that engagement, that juicy engagement. And yeah, this was the project organization and the arrangement of Obsolescence. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments, and I will see you in the next one. Bye bye.